Good morning. My name is John Crabtree. I'm the pastor of First United Methodist Church in Mountain City, Tennessee, and Trade United Methodist Church in Trade, Tennessee. I want to welcome you to our Wednesday Ephatha Bible study for Wednesday the 23rd-ish, and I hope you guys are having a great week. Today's coffee mug is from Crater of Diamonds State Park in Arkansas. We had a lovely little getaway there and got to hunt for diamonds. It's this giant open field. It's actually the caldera of an ancient volcano. And so you can find diamonds and other gemstones there just kind of laying on the ground. And so we poked around, didn't find any diamonds, but we had a really good day. It was, I'd like to go back there sometime. It was a lot of fun. So we got a mug to commemorate. This was probably more valuable than whatever I found. But anyway, it was a good day. Good memory. But last week we talked about Jacob and Esau, and Jacob, I hate to use the term swindling, but swindling Esau out of his birthright and getting the blessing of Isaac with the connivance of his mother Rebekah. And so Rebekah sends Jacob off to keep him from getting killed by his brother Esau, who's rightfully really angry with him. So Isaac goes off to find himself a wife. He's been sent back to his father's homeland, to his mother's people, to look for a wife among the relations there. So we're in Genesis chapter 28, beginning in verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke up from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Bethel means stairway or ramp. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. Now we probably need to take a moment or two and talk about the content of Jacob's dream, about the ladder famed in song and story. You guys know the song, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. Well, that's the ladder in this story. And I honestly don't want to get too much into, or try to read too much into that, because Jacob's immediate response is, this is God's house right here. This is the place where heaven and earth intersect. And in a spiritual sense, this is going to be the promised land. The temple with God's presence is going to be there somewhere in the promised land. I don't know if this is the exact spot, but I kind of doubt it. But Jacob really associates that with that particular spot, and I don't want us to get too locked into the idea that that is the central train station for the angels coming in and out of heaven, if you will. I much more want us to keep the idea that God's presence and God's messengers, the angels, are all over the place, and that they're not places that God's presence, God's self, God's messengers can't go. So I think it's interesting to see that representation, but I think Jacob was seeing something he could understand, and God was revealing God's interaction with the world. But I don't want us to get locked into the place as much as Jacob obviously did. I think God was showing him the truth in that there is a constant to and fro. God is not remote. God is not far away. God is not uninterested in what's going on earth. God is always actively working. And yeah, it's angels going up and down, but they're all the messengers of God doing God's business, God's work. They're the hands of God, just like we are in a very real sense. So it's an important dream, but I don't want to get too locked into a literalistic interpretation that is the place. I think it's much more a symbolic truth. And the truths of God, the truths of the Bible, they in many cases transcend the literal interpretation of them. I think what we're seeing here is the revelation that God is actively involved, constantly involved, busily involved with God's creation, rather than that being just being localized in that particular one spot. So hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense. So here we have maybe I guess you'd say a different side of Jacob. He is a bit of a trickster, a bit of a conniver, but when he meets God, when he experiences God, his instinctive and first response is awe and adoration and worship and thanksgiving. Yeah, there's a little bit of horse trading going in there too, and that's very much Jacob's nature. If you'll take care of me, you'll be my God. But he responds with faith and with worship and with adoration when he encounters the presence of God. So in that, we see that Jacob may not be perfect, but in his heart, he does love God. And he has great respect and reverence for God. So I think that's one of the reasons that God continues to work through Jacob and through other folks too, that they may not be perfect, but in their hearts they do love God. And they're willing to be what God needs them to be. They're willing to do their part. And I think that's really important. We're getting the yard mode, so it's pardon the noise. So that's really important, and it's important to remember that even when these folks aren't being perfect, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later too, that God is still using them. God still loves them. God still has care and concern for them. When they stumble, or when they make a mistake, or when they just do something they shouldn't do, God doesn't cast them aside. That's important, because when we stumble and do things we shouldn't do, God's not going to cast us aside. Our human tendency and all those negative voices that we hear in our heads and maybe outside as well tell us that we're worthless if we fail, or if something goes wrong, then we can't be used by God anymore. And that's not necessarily the case. So that's one of the reasons we read these ancient accounts and see how God has dealt with a troublesome humanity from the beginning, and we know that God's still doing that, and that's really comforting, that God is still willing to deal with us in our humanness, in our imperfection. So it's really amazing that Jacob is worshiping, and without the forms of worship that we would recognize. I mean, he didn't have church. He didn't really build an altar or anything like that. Although this is prior to those times of formalized, laid out worship. His sort of instinctive worship response was to mark the place and anoint it with oil and signify by his actions and his words and the way he treats that space that this is a special, sacred space, and it's going to be set apart for that use. So this instinct to worship is deeply rooted in people. But here with the people of God, it's maybe a little more explicit, or I think this is one of the reasons that God chooses these folks, and you could also argue that having chosen them, God also equips them for their work. So this instinct to worship is something that's deeply rooted in them and in us, that when we encounter God, we want to mark that, we want to remember that, we want to signify that by actions, by words. And a rock on the ground is not what you would think of as a huge, impressive monument, but that was what he had at hand, and that's what he had to worship. And by all accounts, God was pleased with that. So we don't. The work of worship comes from inside us, much less so than what we're able to accomplish with our hands, like building things and stuff like that. So the intention of worship, the heart of worship, is coming from inside. And Jacob, for all his faults, which he had quite a few, had that. And that's something that we can look up to, something that we can learn from. So Jacob carries on, and he comes to Haran, which is his mother's Rebecca. That's her home place, and finds a well and some sheep and some flocks and some herdsmen, shepherds. And in 29:4, Jacob says to the shepherds, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, son of Nahor?" Remember, Laban is his mother Rebekah's brother, so Laban is his uncle. They said, "We do." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" "Yes," they replied, "and here is his daughter Rachel, coming with the sheep." And he, Jacob, says, "Well, look, it's still broad daylight. This is not the time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and then go pasture them." The shepherd said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled away from the well. Then we'll water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob wept, and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and wept aloud. Don't you know Rachel was thinking, who is this guy? 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. When Laban heard the news about his sister's son Jacob, he ran to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him, and brought him to his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, "Surely you're my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him for a month. 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what will your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. So Rachel is his first cousin, and back in the ancient world, it was much more common for families and tribes to keep their lineage to marry within their own people. In fact, that's what God had told for them to do. For Abraham, and then for Isaac, and now Jacob, to not intermarry with the Canaanites and the folks, I guess you'd say outside the promise, but to keep the line of the families of the promise alive, and to kind of keep that close, and not intermarry and intermingle with some of the other peoples that were around them. We'll talk about that much later on when they enter the promised land, and why that is. So this is very common, very accepted in the ancient world, and it illustrates some of the differences in the ancient world and today. When folks get all excited talking about marriage in the Bible, they forget there are so many different types of marriages and arrangements in here. So yeah, we need to be careful when we talk about that. So Jacob loves Rachel and says he will work for her for 7 years, and yeah, so he does that. And it just seems like a few days because he loves her so much. So Jacob the trickster, Jacob the conniver, he has a heart for worship. He worships God. He has a heart that's willing to have reverence for God, and he's able and willing to love. And so maybe he's not such a bad guy after all. But isn't that kind of our human story? We're not all one thing, but we're mixture of good and maybe not so good. If you saw the worship stream Sunday, or we're in church Sunday, we talked about that sometimes we're the wheat that's planted and flourishes and is fruitful, and sometimes we're the weeds that aren't really doing what they're supposed to be doing. But the good news is God still loves us. And Jacob is going to have some more adventures. So we'll probably pick that up next week, because Jacob and Rachel and Leah have a very complicated domestic arrangement. So we'll talk about that a little bit next time. But I hope you guys have a blessed week, and we will see you then. Thanks. God bless. Bye-bye.